It was November 15th, 1944. Under a pale Midwestern sky, a train groaned to a halt, its cars filled with German prisoners of war. The sound of steel on steel echoed through the quiet town, where locals watched from a distance, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The men who emerged were not the fearsome conquerors they once were. They were weary soldiers, most between the ages of 19 and 30, their uniforms frayed and their eyes hollowed by battle and hunger. They carried the dust of far-off battlefields on their boots, strangers in a land of neat white farmhouses and vast harvested fields. The prisoners braced for the worst. For years, propaganda had painted Americans as brutes. Capture, they believed, meant humiliation, abuse, and starvation. They whispered to one another in hushed German, steeling themselves for the cruelty they thought was inevitable. Some pictured barren camps and withheld food. Others imagined back-breaking labor fueled by little more than scraps. After all, food was scarce even in their homeland. In Hamburg and Berlin, families waited in long lines for black bread and turnip soup. If the fatherland could barely feed its own, what mercy could they expect from the enemy? Trucks rumbled down a dirt road, carrying them past an endless expanse of farmland. Rows of corn stubble stretched to the horizon, dotted with bright red barns and silos standing like sentinels. To the Germans, the sight was bewildering. Their own country was a landscape of bomb craters and burnt-out cities. Here, the land was untouched, prosperous, almost indifferent to the war. A bitter question was muttered under their breath. How could America possess so much when Germany had so little left? The convoy finally arrived at the camp, a collection of simple wooden barracks behind orderly fences. As the gates opened, guards barked orders in a language many prisoners only vaguely understood. The men filed inside, their shoulders tense, still expecting the punishment they felt was coming. But they were not led to cells. They were led to a mess hall. Inside, long tables were set, and a rich, savory aroma of hot food hung in the air. The prisoners froze. They were to stunned astonishment. The bread was impossibly soft, almost sweet, a luxury he never dreamed of in captivity. Others plunged their spoons into the warm stew, the flavor chasing away the cold memory of watery cabbage soup. When a few of them lifted the peaches to their lips, the sudden taste of sugar was so overwhelming it nearly brought them to tears. One prisoner's eyes welled up as he whispered, "This is what victory tastes like." In that moment, something shifted. The Americans hadn't used violence or starvation to subdue them. They had used food. It was more than just nourishment. It was a symbol. It was undeniable proof of an abundance that was helping to turn the tide of the war. As the German soldiers ate, their minds grappled with a difficult truth. If this was how a nation fed its prisoners, how could their own homeland ever hope for victory? The guards watched with a practiced, detached air. For them, it was just another meal, another shift. But for the prisoners, every bite was a revelation. They had been taught that America was decadent and weak, a nation softened by luxury. Yet the evidence in their hands told a different story. America's strength wasn't just in its weapons, but in its ability to provide, steadily and abundantly, even for its enemies. That night, lying on their bunks with the taste of sugar and bread still on their tongues, the prisoners whispered in the dark. Some joked that it might be worth losing the war just to eat so well. Others were silent, wrestling with the uncomfortable truth of their enemy's prosperity. One thought lingered in the darkness, shared among them all. They hadn't just been captured by a nation with a stronger army. They had been captured by a way of life they could no longer ignore. The rhythm of life inside the American prisoner of war camp quickly settled into a deceptively simple routine. a cycle that revolved around the clanging of the mess hall bell. That sound cut across the compound like a summons, and every man, whether he was 19 or 35, felt his body respond instinctively, pulled forward by the ghost of a hunger he was only just beginning to forget. They would form lines, their boots scraping against the wooden floors, the scent of cooking wafting toward them with a promise at first. Yet it wasn't long before they learned to tame it with sugar and canned milk, treasures they hadn't seen in years. One young prisoner quipped that if Americans drank this potent brew every morning, it was no wonder their soldiers fought with such relentless energy. A ripple of laughter went through the line, but beneath it lay a profound sense of awe. Lunch and dinner brought even greater marvels. The meals were not extravagant banquets, but they were consistent, plentiful, and astonishingly varied compared to the thin, watery soups of wartime Germany. Potatoes appeared in abundance, baked, boiled, or fried, served in portions so generous they seemed almost careless. Meat was a constant, sometimes in a hearty beef stew thick with vegetables, other times as that infamous pink slab called Spam. Many had initially recoiled from its strange, uniform appearance, but hunger was a powerful persuader. Soon enough, they grudgingly admitted that its salty, greasy flavor was strangely satisfying. Jokes about Spam became a camp fixture, with men vowing that once they returned home, they would never touch the stuff again. But if Spam drew ridicule, other items inspired something closer to reverence. When chocolate bars appeared, wrapped in foil or pressed into dense ration squares, a hush would fall over the mess hall. Men unwrapped them slowly, as if handling a precious artifact, letting the rich sweetness melt on their tongues. For a moment, their eyes would close, and they would be transported back to childhood memories of market stalls and forgotten holidays. Canned peaches held a similar power. The thick syrup glistened like liquid gold in the dim light, and the soft, sweet fruit felt like the height of indulgence. A former baker from Cologne confessed with tears in his eyes that he hadn't tasted fruit in 3 years. He ate his portion slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be his last. The men's senses were confirmed by hard numbers. American rations were designed to provide nearly 3,200 calories a day, a diet carefully balanced to sustain a soldier in combat. By contrast, Germany in 1944 was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and crippling shortages. Civilians were surviving on as little as 1,000 stomachs. They knew their families were enduring starvation. Letters from home, when they managed to arrive, were filled with stories of empty pantries and children fainting from hunger in school. The contrast was a constant torment. "My mother would give her life for the scraps we leave on our plates," a prisoner from Kansas whispered one evening. Another replied, "Perhaps that is why we are here, to see what our nation denied us." Slowly, however, disbelief and suspicion gave way to a grudging acceptance. The food kept coming, as steady and reliable as the sunrise. They started to joke in the lines, nudging each other when the strange, sticky paste called peanut butter appeared, which they declared was both foul and irresistible. They teased each other about gaining weight, about going home plumper than when they marched off to war. But what they couldn't laugh away was the profound realization taking root. The food was more than sustenance. It was evidence of a system that worked. In the strict hierarchy of the Reich, scarcity was a tool of control. Here, the equality of the rations was astonishing. The guards ate the same bread and meat as the prisoners. There was no special officer's table groaning with delicacies, while the lower ranks went hungry. To men raised on division and privilege, this simple fairness was as shocking as the abundance itself. The mess hall had become a quiet classroom, and each meal was a lesson. It was a lesson in a different kind of power, a power that could afford to be humane.
As the weeks turned into months, the initial shock of abundance began to fade, replaced by a subtler and more unsettling realization. The Americans were not merely feeding their captives. They were treating them with a degree of humanity that the prisoners had never anticipated. At first, they had braced for cruelty, convinced that any kindness was merely a mask that would eventually slip to reveal the true face of the enemy. But the mask never fell. Instead, the daily routine revealed something far more disarming: ordinary, unthinking decency. The guards were not the hardened tyrants of their propaganda-fueled nightmares. They were young men, many barely out of high school, who carried themselves with a quiet.
Prisoners, lying on their bunks in the darkness, listened with a mixture of envy and fascination. They whispered to each other that such music would be banned in Berlin, dismissed as decadent and corrupting. Yet here, it was played openly, joyfully. One prisoner admitted quietly that the sound created an ache inside him, not because it was foreign, but because it carried a sense of freedom he couldn't quite name. This transformation was not immediate or universal. Many prisoners clung fiercely to their anger, reminding each other of their bombed-out cities and starving families back home. To accept kindness from the enemy felt like a betrayal, but the steady drip of small details wore down their resistance. A guard pausing to help an injured prisoner to the infirmary, another sharing a cigarette after a long day's work detail. These acts were not grand or calculated. They were simple, human, and all the more powerful for it. The prisoners began to see reflections of themselves in the faces of their captors. They watched an American soldier meticulously tying his boot, another sneezing in the cold, a third carefully tucking a worn photograph back into his pocket. In these small moments, the monstrous image of the faceless enemy dissolved. The men on the other side of the fence were not beasts. They were sons, brothers, and husbands, ordinary in the exact same way they were. That recognition was more destabilizing than any weapon. Letters from home deepened the stark contrast. Their families wrote of ever-worsening shortages, of endless lines for a single loaf of bread, of roofs caved in by bombing raids. Mothers described children who were too thin for their age. The prisoners read these words while wiping peach syrup from their lips, the guilt sharp and biting. But, alongside that guilt, a harder feeling began to grow: respect. It was respect for a nation that could maintain such staggering abundance, not just for its own people, but for its captives. The sheer normalcy they witnessed on work details was just as astonishing. They were brought into American towns to work on farms or in factories, and they saw farmers driving tractors, markets with fully stocked shelves, and children laughing in schoolyards. Reevaluation was as dangerous and unsettling as any weapon they had ever faced. Some prisoners began to secretly document their thoughts in hidden diaries. "We expected the fist," one man scrawled in pencil. "Instead, we found bread. And bread is worse, because it feeds the body but disarms the spirit." Another wrote, "Here I see that equality is real. Their soldiers eat like kings, yet they are not kings. They are ordinary men who are not hungry. This is a power beyond our imagination." The transformation reached its most delicate stage when gratitude began to form. Gratitude was a perilous emotion. It threatened loyalty to their homeland and whispered of a reconciliation they weren't ready for. Yet in quiet moments, men would admit to one another that they were thankful. Thankful to eat, to sleep without fear, to be seen not as subhuman beasts, but as men. It didn't erase their anger, but it complicated it, softening its sharp edges and making it harder to cling to pure hatred. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a German prisoner leaned against the wire fence, watching an American guard meticulously polishing his boots. The guard noticed him, looked up, and for a long moment their eyes met. Neither man spoke, But in that shared silence, something undeniable passed between them: recognition. They were two men, bound by war and separated by wire, but both were simply, irreducibly human. That moment of connection, more than any meal of Spam or peaches, was the true nourishment of the camp. As the weeks turned into months, the prisoners came to understand a truth more unsettling than their military defeat. They had come to know their enemy not just as a conqueror, but as a mirror that reflected a vision of abundance, equality, and humanity, all things their own nation had promised but had failed to deliver. They realized that the greatest weapon America wielded was not its bombs or its tanks. It was this quiet revelation, hidden in plain sight, carried on every tray of food and in every small gesture of decency. When the war at last came to an end and the gates of the American camp swung open, the German prisoners carried more than just their meager belongings. They carried memories, tastes, and a profound understanding that would remain with them with bitter disbelief. "You ate like kings while we starved," one mother snapped at her son, and the guilt burned in him. But beneath that guilt was a firm recognition. They had seen a nation capable of a level of sustenance and generosity that could not be unseen or forgotten. The American decision to treat its prisoners humanely was not simply an act of charity. It was a deliberate policy, rooted in the Geneva Convention, but also in a strategic vision. Leaders like General Dwight D. Eisenhower believed that demonstrating America's fairness and abundance could be a weapon more persuasive than any bullet. It was a gamble on the power of humanity, and for many, it paid off. Food became a quiet, persistent argument for the strength of a system that did not need to starve its enemies to prove its dominance. Not every man was changed. Some returned home with their bitterness hardened, unwilling to let kindness soften their view of the enemy. But for countless others, the experience planted seeds of respect, even admiration. Many former prisoners of war would go on to speak positively of their time in captivity, with some even choosing to return to the United States after the war as immigrants. Their stories often began not with the horrors of the battlefield, but with the simple, shocking memory of being fed by their enemy. In the end, the German prisoners discovered that America's true strength was not in its armies, but in its tables, its fields, and its capacity to nourish. When we look back at those camps scattered across the American heartland, the images that linger are not of brutality, but of quiet, startling revelations. Young men in tattered uniforms, their eyes wide with disbelief as they chewed on soft white bread. It is the sound of laughter echoing over a shared meal of Spam and peanut butter, and the sight of silent tears shed over the impossible sweetness of canned peaches. These raw, unplanned moments became part of a larger legacy, proof that sometimes victory is measured not in the ruin you inflict, but in the humanity you extend.